The metallic glint of the pistol caught the afternoon sunlight, like a shard of broken glass. Karen Whitfield stood on her pristine front porch, weapon drawn, her voice cutting through the suburban calm like a blade. "Get off my street before I make you." The words hung in the air, poisonous and final, directed at three black children whose only crime was playing tag on the sidewalk. I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. My finger found the record button on my phone without conscious thought. Muscle memory from 20 years in law enforcement, taking over when my mind could barely process what I was witnessing. The phone screen lit up with that familiar red dot, and I angled it carefully to capture everything. Every gesture, every word, every terrifying second of what was unfolding in this quiet neighborhood in Millbrook Heights. 30 minutes earlier, the biggest worry in my world had been whether my nephew Marcus would scrape his knee running too fast on the concrete. I was visiting my sister Elena for the first time in 3 months, finally taking the vacation days that had been piling up like unread case files. The boys, Marcus and his younger brother Damon, had been bouncing off the walls of Elena's house since breakfast, their energy infectious even to a 42-year-old who spent most of his time behind a desk reviewing firearms violations and coordinating with federal agencies. "Uncle David, can we play outside?" Marcus had asked, his 8-year-old face earnest and hopeful. "Mom said we have to ask you first." Elena had rolled her eyes from the kitchen doorway, flour dusting her apron. "They've been asking every 5 minutes since you got here. I think they're more excited to show off their uncle than they are to get fresh air." I remembered looking at those two faces, Marcus with his gap-toothed grin, and Damon with his serious 10-year-old expression, and feeling something loosen in my chest. When had I last played with kids? When had I last done anything that didn't involve reading incident reports or testifying in court cases? "What did you have in mind, tag?" they'd shouted in unison, and before I knew it, we were outside in the warm May sunshine, running up and down the sidewalk like I was 8 years old again myself. The neighborhood was picture-perfect in that aggressive suburban way. Every lawn manicured to golf course standards, every mailbox painted and polished, every driveway pressure-washed until the concrete gleamed. Elena had moved here 3 years ago after her divorce, drawn by the good schools and the promise of safety for her boys. "It's quiet," she told me when she first showed me the house. "The kids can actually play outside without me having a heart attack every 5 minutes." The irony would be bitter later. But in those first 29 minutes, it really was perfect. We'd established the rules quickly. The tree in Elena's front yard was base. You could run anywhere on the sidewalk. But stepping on the grass of any yard was automatic tag. Damon was it first, his longer legs giving him an advantage that Marcus tried to overcome with pure determination and creative route finding. I found myself genuinely laughing for the first time in weeks as Marcus executed an elaborate fake-out maneuver around the Johnsons' mailbox, leaving Damon spinning in circles. The sound of their laughter echoed off the houses, mixing with the distant hum of lawnmowers and the rustle of leaves in the old oak trees that lined Maple Street. That's when I first noticed her, Karen Whitfield, though I didn't know her name yet, standing in her doorway 3 houses down from Elena's. Even from a distance, her posture radiated disapproval. Arms crossed, face pinched into a scowl that seemed permanently etched into her features. She was watching us with the intensity of a security guard watching suspected shoplifters. At first, I chalked it up to the universal annoyance of adults who'd forgotten what it felt like to be young. Maybe she was trying to nap. Maybe she had a headache. Maybe she was just one of those people who believed children should be seen and not heard. Preferably neither. But something about the way she kept checking her watch, the way she kept looking up and down the street as if expecting reinforcements, set off warning bells that 20 years in law enforcement had fine-tuned to a razor's edge. "Uncle David," Marcus called out, breaking my concentration. "You're not even trying." He was right. I'd been standing there for at least 30 seconds, lost in observation mode, while Damon crept closer and closer to tagging me. I broke into a run, my dress shoes slapping against the concrete in a rhythm that probably sounded like thunder to every dog in the neighborhood. That's when Karen made her move. The front door of 1247 Maple Street slammed open with a bang that made all three of us freeze mid-stride. Karen Whitfield emerged like a force of nature, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years getting her way through sheer volume and persistence. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching down her front walkway with the determined stride of someone going to war. She was a woman in her mid-50s, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent mask of irritation. Her clothes were expensive, everything pressed and coordinated. But there was something about her eyes that made me think of cornered animals. Marcus and Damon instinctively moved closer to me, their game forgotten. I felt my uncle instincts kick in, followed immediately by my professional ones. This woman was escalating a situation that didn't need escalating, and experience told me that people who did that usually had reasons that had nothing to do with children playing tag. "We're just playing a game," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "Is there a problem?" Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "A problem you're casing the neighborhood. Is what you're doing. Don't think I don't know what this is." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard this before. Of course, in my line of work. You heard every variation of racial profiling and coded language until you could recite them in your sleep. But hearing it, directed at my nephews, at children who were guilty of nothing more than being black and joyful in a space someone had decided they didn't belong, made something dangerous and cold settle in my stomach. "Ma'am," I said, the word coming out harder than I'd intended. "These are my nephews. We're visiting my sister, who lives right there." I pointed to Elena's house, visible through the oak trees. "We're playing tag." "Tag," she repeated, investing the word with enough contempt to wither flowers. "Is that what they're calling it now, running back and forth? Checking out which houses have security cameras? Which ones have expensive cars in the driveways?" Damon's hand found mine, his small fingers gripping tight. He was only 10, but he was old enough to understand the tone, if not all the words. Marcus, younger and more confused, looked between Karen and me with growing alarm. "You need to calm down," I said, letting just a hint of authority creep into my voice. "These children haven't done anything wrong. If you have concerns about suspicious activity, you should call the police." That's when her expression changed. The mask of righteous indignation slipped for just a moment, and I saw something uglier underneath. Something that made my hand itch for the weapon I wasn't carrying because I was on vacation. Playing with kids, not expecting to need to protect them from someone who looked like a suburban mother. "Oh, I'm going to call the police," she said, pulling out her phone with theatrical flourish. "I'm going to tell them there's a black mob forming in my neighborhood. I'm going to tell them about the scouting mission for gang robberies that's happening right under their noses." The casual way she said it, the way she weaponized those words like she'd done it before, made my blood pressure spike. But it was the reactions from the boys that really got to me. The way Marcus's shoulders slumped, like he was shrinking into himself. The way Damon's grip on my hand tightened until his knuckles went white. They'd heard this before. I realized, maybe not the exact words, but the tone. The implication that their existence in certain spaces was inherently threatening, inherently wrong. And that understanding hit me like a freight train, because I'd spent their entire lives trying to shield them from exactly this kind of poison. "Ma'am, you need to stop," I said, my voice carrying the weight of every arrest I'd ever made, every criminal I'd ever faced down. You are harassing children. You are making false accusations. And you are about to make a very big mistake." But Karen Whitfield was already dialing, her fingers stabbing at the numbers with violent precision. I heard the ringtone, tinny through her phone speaker, and felt the situation spiraling beyond my control. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, hello. I need police immediately at 1247 Maple Street in Millbrook Heights. There's a group of black males who've been casing my neighborhood for the past hour. They're clearly planning some kind of robbery or break-in. I think they might be armed. The lies came so easily, so smoothly, that I knew this wasn't her first time. She was practiced at this, comfortable with using law enforcement as a weapon against people she decided didn't belong. And the worst part was, I knew exactly how this would play out. I'd been on the other side of these calls too many times. Police would arrive, already primed to see threat instead of children. They'd see 3 black males in an expensive neighborhood, and their hands would move to their weapons. They'd ask questions later, if at all. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. My phone was already in my hand, and I opened the camera app with movements so practiced they were automatic. The red record button glowed like a warning light. "Officers, please hurry," Karen continued, her voice rising with manufactured panic. "They're getting aggressive. The adult male is making threats. I think they might have weapons." I positioned my phone carefully, making sure to capture her face, her stance, her complete fabrication of events. 20 years in law enforcement had taught me that video evidence was often the only thing that stood between truth and whatever story people decided to tell afterward. But Karen wasn't done escalating. She hung up the phone and disappeared back into her house, leaving us standing on the sidewalk like actors waiting for the next scene to begin. The boys were quiet now, the joy of our game completely extinguished. "Uncle David," Marcus whispered, "are we in trouble?" I knelt down to his level, keeping my phone recording but trying to shield the boys from whatever was coming next. "You didn't do anything wrong, buddy. Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices, but that's not your fault." "Should we go back to Mom's house?" Damon asked, his 10-year-old wisdom already calculating escape routes, before I could answer. Karen's front door opened again, and this time, she wasn't alone. The gun was a Glock 19 matte black, and held with the confident grip of someone who'd spent time at a shooting range. She kept it low, but visible, not quite pointing it at us, but making sure we could all see it. Her other hand held her phone, still recording. "I told you to get off my street," she said, her voice steady now, controlled. "The police are coming, but I'm not waiting for them to handle this." The transformation was complete. The suburban mom mask had been discarded entirely, replaced by something far more dangerous. This was a woman who'd been planning this moment, who'd been waiting for an excuse to pull that trigger. I moved instinctively, placing myself between the gun and the children. My phone kept recording, capturing every second of what was about to become the most important video I'd ever taken. "Ma'am, you need to put that weapon down immediately," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down armed suspects in situations far more dangerous than this. "You are threatening children. You are brandishing a firearm in a public space. You are committing multiple felonies." Her laugh was wild, unhinged. "Felonies, I'm protecting my neighborhood from a gang of thugs. I'm exercising my Second Amendment rights on my own property." "The sidewalk is not your property," I replied, taking a careful step backward while keeping the boys behind me. "And those are children, not thugs. You need to lower your weapon before someone gets hurt." That's when the neighbors started emerging from their houses. At first, just faces and windows, people drawn by the commotion. Then, Mrs. Patterson from across the street opened her front door, her elderly face creased with concern. "Karen, "What in God's name are you doing?" she called out, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd lived on this street longer than anyone else. "Stay back, Eleanor," Karen shouted, swinging the gun in a wide arc that made everyone freeze. "These criminals are dangerous." More neighbors appeared. The young couple from next door, the Hendersons with their 3 kids, old Mr. Garcia from the corner house. One by one, they took in the scene a middle-aged white woman with a gun, facing down a black man with 2 terrified children. "Karen, put that gun down," someone shouted from behind us. I recognized Elena's voice and felt my heart skip a beat. She was running toward us, her face white with terror. "Those are my children!" she screamed. "That's my brother. What is wrong with you?" For a moment, Karen's certainty wavered. The arrival of Elena, clearly the boy's mother, clearly from the neighborhood, seemed to crack the narrative she'd built in her head. But only for a moment. "I don't care who you say you are," she snarled, raising the gun higher. "I saw what I saw. They were casing houses. They were planning something." The siren started then, distant but growing closer. I felt a complex mix of relief and dread. Relief because hopefully this would end before someone got shot. Dread because I knew exactly what the arriving officers would see: a white woman with a legal firearm, claiming to defend herself against suspicious black males. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I kept my phone recording, but I pulled out my wallet with my free hand. The badge was tucked behind my driver's license, gold and blue, and carrying the weight of 2 decades in law enforcement. "Ma'am," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos with unmistakable authority. "I am Chief David Williams, Director of Statewide Firearms Regulation for the Department of Justice. I am ordering you to lower your weapon immediately." The effect was immediate and electric. Karen's eyes went wide, the gun wavering in her grip. The neighbors who'd been shouting fell silent. Even the boys behind me seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted. "You're what?" "I'm the state's top firearms regulation official," I continued, holding my badge high enough for everyone to see. "I investigate illegal weapons usage. I coordinate with federal agencies on gun crimes. And I am recording every second of your illegal brandishing of a firearm at children." The gun dropped to her side, like it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. Her face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding about the magnitude of her mistake. But you're," she stammered. "Black?" I finished for her. "Yes, I am. I'm also a 20-year veteran of law enforcement. I have a master's degree in criminology, and I've testified before Congress on firearm safety. And right now, I'm documenting what appears to be a racially motivated assault with a deadly weapon." The first police car rounded the corner at that moment, followed by 2 more. I kept my badge visible and raised my free hand, a gesture that every law enforcement officer would recognize as non-threatening. My phone kept recording. The lead officer was a sergeant I didn't recognize, a black woman in her 30s, who took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen variations of this too many times. She spotted my badge immediately and approached with cautious professionalism. "Chief Williams," she asked, her voice carrying just enough question to confirm my identity without challenging it. "Sergeant," I replied, keeping my voice level and official. "I need you to secure that weapon from the subject. She's been brandishing it at children for the past several minutes. I have the entire incident on video." What followed was a masterclass in how quickly situations can reverse when the power dynamics shift. Karen Whitfield, who minutes before had been wielding authority like a weapon, suddenly found herself on the wrong end of everything she'd thought she controlled. "Ma'am, I need you to set that firearm on the ground immediately," the sergeant said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd done this many times before. Karen's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had carried her through her confrontation finally catching up with her. "But officer, I called you. I'm the victim here. These people were threatening me. Ma'am, weapon on the ground. Now." The Glock hit the concrete with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet neighborhood. One of the other officers secured it immediately, while the sergeant approached Karen with handcuffs at the ready. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for brandishing a firearm, making false statements to emergency services, and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." I turned off the recording and knelt down to check on Marcus and Damon, who had been remarkably brave throughout the entire ordeal. Elena was there too, gathering them into a fierce hug that seemed to encompass all the fear and relief of the past 20 minutes. "Are you boys okay?" I asked, running my hands over their heads, checking for any signs of trauma or injury. "Uncle David," Marcus said, his voice small but steady. "Are you really a police chief?" I laughed, the sound coming out shaky with relief. "Something like that. Buddy, I help make sure people follow the rules about guns." "That lady wasn't following the rules," Damon observed with 10-year-old directness. "No," I agreed. "She definitely wasn't." As Karen was being loaded into the police car, her threats and justifications growing more desperate and incoherent, I found myself thinking about all the times this same scene had played out with different endings. All the times when there hadn't been a badge, hadn't been a camera, hadn't been neighbors willing to speak up. The sergeant approached me as the last of the paperwork was being completed. "Chief, I'll need a copy of that video for evidence." "Of course," I replied, already thinking about how this footage would be used not just in Karen's prosecution, but as a training tool, as evidence of the kind of weaponized racism that still poisoned communities across the country. "Sir," she asked, hesitating slightly, "can I ask you something off the record?" I nodded. "How many times do you think this has happened without someone like you being there to witness it?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that we both understood. "Too many," I said finally. "Way too many." The emergency HOA meeting was called for 7 p.m. that evening. Word had spread through the neighborhood with the speed that only truly shocking news could achieve. By the time I walked into the community center's main room, every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. I'd spent the afternoon making phone calls, ensuring that the video was properly preserved and distributed to the relevant authorities. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had already expressed interest. The State Attorney General's office was reviewing the case for potential hate crime charges, and my own department was beginning an investigation into whether Karen Whitfield's firearms license should have been issued in the first place. But tonight wasn't about official investigations. Tonight was about a community confronting what had happened in their midst, and what they were going to do about it. The HOA president, a nervous-looking man named Robert Chen, called the meeting to order with hands that visibly shook as he shuffled his papers. "We're here tonight to discuss the incident that occurred this afternoon on Maple Street." "Incident. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a knife. She was sitting in the front row, her elderly frame radiating indignation. "A woman pulled a gun on children. That's not an incident. That's a crime." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd. I saw Elena sitting near the middle of the room, flanked by several neighbors who had obviously appointed themselves as her supporters. The boys were at home with a babysitter, spared from having to relive the afternoon's trauma in public. "Chief Williams," Robert continued, nodding in my direction, "would you be willing to share what you witnessed?" I stood up, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "I have video footage of the entire incident," I said, holding up my phone. "I want to warn everyone, that what you're about to see is disturbing. It shows a woman making false accusations against children, calling 911 with fabricated claims, and ultimately threatening those children with a deadly weapon. The room was absolutely silent as I connected my phone to the community center's projection system. The video filled the wall-mounted screen in crisp detail. Karen's face enlarged to show every expression, every gesture, every moment of escalation. Watching it again, removed from the immediate terror of the moment, was somehow worse. You could see the calculation in Karen's movements, the way she'd deliberately chosen to escalate rather than de-escalate. You could hear the fear in the children's voices, see the way they'd instinctively moved closer to me for protection. When Karen's voice filled the room, claiming there was a black mob forming for gang robberies, several people audibly gasped. When she emerged from her house with the gun, someone in the back row stood up and walked out, unable to watch anymore. The video ran for 12 minutes and 37 seconds. When it ended, the silence stretched on for long moments before the eruption began. "How long has she been living here?" someone demanded. "Has she done this before? Why didn't anyone report her racist behavior?" "Some of us tried," a voice called out from the middle of the room. It was a young black woman I hadn't met, holding a baby who couldn't have been more than a year old. She's been making comments about urban crime and property values since she moved in. The HOA said it wasn't their problem unless she violated specific community rules. Robert Chen's face went red. We never received any formal complaints." "Because you didn't want to hear them," Mrs. Patterson interjected, her voice carrying the moral authority of her 83 years. "I've been living in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I know racism when I see it. We all chose to look the other way because it was easier than confronting it." The conversation that followed was messy, emotional, and necessary. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before found themselves debating the difference between being uncomfortable and being threatened. Parents talked about explaining to their children why someone would point a gun at other children for playing outside. "What I want to know," said a man I recognized from earlier that afternoon, one of the neighbors who had come out to witness the confrontation, "is what we're going to do to make sure this never happens again." We're going to start by acknowledging that it shouldn't have taken a law enforcement officer being present for this to be taken seriously, I said, standing up again. What happened this afternoon was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern of behavior that this community chose to ignore until it escalated to the point where someone could have been killed. I paused, looking around the room at faces that ranged from ashamed to angry to determined. Karen Whitfield will face the legal consequences of her actions. But that's not enough. You need to examine the culture that allowed her to feel comfortable escalating to violence. You need to ask yourselves why it took a gun being drawn for anyone to speak up. Elena stood up then, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "I moved to this neighborhood because I wanted my children to be safe. I wanted them to be able to play outside without fear. Today, I learned that the biggest threat to their safety wasn't crime or traffic or any of the things I worried about. It was a neighbor who saw their existence as a threat to her version of what this community should look like." She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "My children are 8 and 10 years old. They were playing tag on a sidewalk, and a woman with a gun decided that was threatening enough to warrant potentially ending their lives. If you're not horrified by that, if you're not committed to making sure it never happens again, then I don't want to live in your community." The applause started slowly, then built into something that filled the room with sound and energy. People were standing, clapping, some wiping away tears. But more importantly, they were talking, making commitments, planning changes. By the end of the evening, the Millbrook Heights HOA had voted to implement mandatory bias training for all residents. They established a community committee to review and address complaints about discriminatory behavior. They voted to donate $50,000 from their reserve fund to local civil rights organizations. Most importantly, they voted unanimously to invite federal oversight of their community practices, ensuring that what happened to Marcus and Damon would be investigated not just as an individual crime, but as part of a broader pattern of civil rights violations. 3 weeks later, I sat in my office reviewing the final reports from the Karen Whitfield case. The stack of papers on my desk told a story that was both satisfying and sobering. Karen had been indicted on 12 separate charges, including child endangerment, making false reports to emergency services, brandishing a firearm, and 2 counts of federal hate crimes. Her legal firearms license had been permanently revoked. Her homeowner's insurance had been canceled. The HOA had voted to foreclose on her property for violating community safety standards. But the broader implications were what really mattered. The video had become a training tool used by police departments across 3 states. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had opened investigations into similar incidents in 17 other communities. 3 federal legislators had cited the case in proposed bills strengthening hate crime legislation. My assistant knocked on the door, interrupting my review. "Chief, you have visitors." Marcus and Damon bounded into my office like they owned the place, followed by Elena carrying a plate of what looked like homemade cookies. They'd been by several times since the incident, partly for the ongoing investigation, but mostly because the boys had decided that having an uncle who was a police chief was the coolest thing that had ever happened to them. "Uncle David," Marcus announced. "Mom said you might want to see the letters we got." Elena smiled, setting down the cookies and pulling out a thick manila envelope. "They've been getting mail from kids all over the country, apparently." The story made national news. I opened the envelope and found dozens of letters, drawings, and cards from children who had seen the news coverage and wanted to express their support. A second grader from Oregon had drawn a picture of Marcus and Damon playing tag under a rainbow. A 5th grade class from Michigan had written a group letter condemning racism and praising the boys' bravery. But the letter that hit me hardest was from a 10-year-old girl in Alabama whose handwriting was careful and precise. "Dear Marcus and Damon, I saw what happened to you on the news. Something like that happened to me last year when I was riding my bike. The lady didn't have a gun, but she called the police and said I was stealing things. I was scared, and I didn't know what to do. But watching you be brave makes me feel like I can be brave too. Thank you for showing me that being different doesn't make us wrong." I looked up at the boys, who were now examining the various awards and certificates on my office walls, with the intense curiosity of children trying to understand what adults do all day. "Do you understand what these letters mean?" I asked them. Damon, always the more serious of the two, considered the question carefully. "They mean that what happened to us happens to other kids too." "Yes," I said, "but they also mean that by being brave, by telling the truth about what happened, you helped other kids feel less alone." "Are we heroes?" Marcus asked with 8-year-old directness. I laughed, ruffling his hair. "You're kids who were playing tag and got caught up in an adult's bad choices. But the way you handled it, the way you stayed calm and stayed together, that was pretty heroic." Elena was quiet, reading through some of the other letters. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "David, there's something else I need to tell you." She pulled out an official-looking document from her purse. "The mayor's office called yesterday. The city council voted unanimously to name the playground at Millbrook Heights Community Park after the boys. They want to call it the Marcus and Damon Williams Memorial Playground for all children." "Memorial?" Marcus asked, looking alarmed. "But we're not dead." Elena laughed through her tears. No, baby, it's a memorial to what happened that day. So people remember that all children deserve to play safely, no matter what they look like. I felt something tight in my chest loosen. A playground named after my nephews. A place where children would play for decades to come, carrying forward the simple message that joy should never be seen as a threat. There's going to be a dedication ceremony next month, Elena continued. They want you to speak. Can we still play tag there? Damon asked, cutting straight to what mattered most. That's exactly what it's for. I told him. That's exactly what it's for. As the boys explored my office, and Elena caught me up on the neighborhood gossip, I found myself thinking about the letter from the girl in Alabama, about all the children who had written to Marcus and Damon, about all the children who would play on that playground in years to come. The video on my phone had been viewed more than 3 million times. It had sparked conversations in communities across the country about racism, about the weaponization of law enforcement, about the courage it takes to stand up when someone decides that your existence is a threat. But in the end, the most important audience for that video hadn't been the millions of strangers who watched it online. It had been the neighbors who came out of their houses, who chose to speak up, who decided that their community could be better than its worst moments. Karen Whitfield had pulled a gun on children playing tag. She had weaponized her racism and her privilege and her access to firearms in a way that could have ended with tragedy. But she had made one crucial miscalculation. She hadn't known that the man recording her was the person responsible for ensuring that people like her couldn't use guns to terrorize children. She hadn't known that her moment of unchecked power would become evidence of her own undoing. Most importantly, she hadn't known that a community confronted with the reality of what had been happening in their midst would choose justice over comfort, accountability over denial. Uncle David, Marcus said, interrupting my thoughts. When we go to the playground ceremony, can we play tag there? I looked at his bright, hopeful face, at his brother's matching grin, at their mother's proud smile. I thought about the letters from children across the country, about the playground that would bear their names, about the conversations that were happening in communities everywhere because 2 boys had been brave enough to keep playing, even when someone tried to make them stop. Absolutely, I said. That's exactly what we're going to do. And as we sat there in my office, surrounded by the evidence of cases solved and justice served, I realized that sometimes the most important victories don't come from the courtroom, or the legislature, or the policy manual. Sometimes they come from the simple act of refusing to let fear win, of choosing to play anyway, of believing that joy is stronger than hatred. The badge behind the camera had done its job, but the real heroes were 8 and 10 years old, and they were already planning their next game of tag. 6 months later, standing at the podium during the Marcus and Damon Williams Memorial Playground dedication ceremony, I watched as children of every color ran laughing across the new equipment. The irony wasn't lost on me that the playground funded by Karen Whitfield's forfeited assets had become a place where the community she had tried to divide was coming together. The boys were in the thick of it, naturally, leading a massive game of tag that seemed to involve half the children in attendance. Their laughter echoed off the new slides and swings, a sound that carried the promise that maybe, just maybe, the world was getting a little bit better. And when I looked out at the crowd of parents and neighbors and children, all of them gathered to celebrate the simple right to play without fear, I knew that the most important video I'd ever recorded had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had shown the world that sometimes the badge behind the camera belongs to someone who knows that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure that children can play tag on the sidewalk, that joy can triumph over hatred, and that communities can choose to be better than their worst moments. The game of tag was still going strong when I left that day, And I had the feeling it would be for a very long time to come.